The history of drugs cannot and will not exist outside of the cultures that use them. This simple fact, ignored by prohibitionists and advocates alike, is the primary reason I started this podcast, and it's truer than it ever has been when it comes to peyote, the slow-growing, bulbous, flowering cactus that has acted as a backbone of indigenous medicine and religious practice for millennia. As we head deeper into the 21st century, we live in a world where it's increasingly understood by liberal-minded people that drug laws have never existed in a vacuum. When a drug is criminalized, or its use controlled or restricted, this is almost always done for a cultural reason. I'm not saying that all drug control or prohibition is necessarily bad. I think most of it is. But in some cases, the cultural reason could be, for instance, an increased understanding that a drug is toxic, or that it is addictive, or both. It's much harder than it used to be to advertise cigarettes, for instance. But far less discussed is that as cultures change, either very slowly or abruptly, so too do the patterns of drug use within those cultures. Very few people used low-dose LSD as a productivity tool in the 1960s, but as Silicon Valley became a dominant cultural force around the turn of the century, so too did microdosing for productivity. That's an example of this change. Now, when it comes to peyote's history, you cannot accurately tell its story without talking about abrupt and sometimes tragic cultural changes which have fundamentally altered the way people use it over and over again. To be honest, using the phrase cultural change here almost feels glib, because we're really talking about the genocide of a continent followed by an ongoing attempt to squash indigenous identity by an occupying power. The subject of peyote is one that has been written about for hundreds of years, and yet one whose history is almost never told within this full context. This is not necessarily a bad thing from the perspective of Native American peyote users, who to this day are often suspicious of non-native people attempting to learn about or write about their religious practices. As you'll understand by the end of the episode, this suspicion is not unfounded. Obviously, we won't be able to cover the entire history of peyote in the course of a 40-minute episode, so if you're interested in learning more, please feel free to email me or DM me on Twitter or Instagram, and I can link you some of the most helpful and informative resources I've found. For the purposes of this episode, I'll be dividing peyote's history into 3 time periods. During each of these phases, peyote use, including whether it was seen as a medicine, a sacrament, an intoxicant, or all of the above, was dramatically influenced by the sometimes slow and sometimes terrifyingly abrupt colonization of the North American continent. The first phase we'll look at, I'll roughly call pre-American. I do want to make an important distinction here that I'm not talking about pre-European, because during this time period, the Spanish conquistadors were quite brutal in their oppression of North American indigenous groups and their religious practices, and did have a massive impact on many of the peyote traditions. But this was still well before the modern landscape of peyote use had taken shape. The second period, to put it bluntly, might as well be called genocide. Much like the first period, European coloners viciously brutalized indigenous inhabitants and decimated their traditions, but a key feature of this second period was America's policy of forcing the survivors of their slaughter onto reservations, which created a new shared identity between cultures that had formerly nothing to do with each other, with peyote use becoming a totem of this new cultural identity. And the third phase I'll call assimilation, but it's far more complicated than that, because what we're really going to be talking about is how indigenous tribes have fought for their right to continue to use peyote under a legal system that neither understands the drug nor respects the sovereignty of these tribes. Without further ado, let's go into part 1. Like many psychoactive plants from around the world, peyote's use stretches back to prehistory, and we see tons of evidence for this. especially in the very limited region in which it naturally grows, a roughly diamond-shaped area sometimes called the Peyote Gardens that encompasses parts of what's now southern Texas and northern Mexico. In the Shumla Caves on the Texas side of the Rio Grande, rock art depicting the cactus's distinctive shape has been found alongside its dried buttons, which have been analyzed using carbon dating and shown to be from roughly 4000 BCE, or 6,000 years ago. Further analysis in a laboratory has shown these buttons to contain around 2% mescaline, which is the principal alkaloid in the cactus responsible for its mental, visionary, and oftentimes spiritual effects. Not all species of peyote contain mescaline, or contain it in sufficient quantities, so this discovery implies that ancient people who lived in this region were almost certainly aware of its psychoactive effects, and believed the cactus important enough to depict in cave art. We don't know how prevalent its use was, or what exactly it was used for in prehistory, but we do know that by the time Spanish settlers arrived in what's now Mexico, it was everywhere, far beyond that small diamond in which it grows wild. There's no evidence that the Aztecs ever cultivated it, but it does show up as a menu item in Aztec drug markets across Mexico at the time of the Spanish conquest. From records kept by Spanish missionaries, it appears that peyote had a bunch of uses, ranging from the medical to the spiritual and everything in between. Keep in mind that our modern understanding of drugs that rigidly segregates medical from recreational is a distinction that has not existed in most cultures throughout history, and as such, it seems like peyote's role for a lot of the cultures in which it's been traditionally used blurs this distinction. A 15th century Aztec man, for instance, might not have the modern bias that a drug used to cure a lung infection shouldn't have the side effect of triggering giggling euphoria or producing an all-consuming vision of talking to God. In fact, these features might not have been seen as side effects at all, but rather part of a mechanism by which the healing took place. Can't cure the lung infection without talking to God. All this aside, it is worth noting the incredibly vast array of purported uses for peyote documented by the Spanish as early as the 16th century. Some of these are common features that we see in nearly every documented peyote using culture today, including applying it externally to wounds as a healing ointment, taking a low dose for energy or heart health, or eating a larger amount in a group setting to produce a spiritual or visionary experience. But some uses at this time were reported widely and now are far less common. One such use is as a stimulant to prepare for battle. Regular listeners to this podcast might be thinking, that sounds familiar, and they would be right. If you listen to episode 3 on the surprising history of ayahuasca and warfare in the Amazon, I discuss the fact that if you dig into the history of ayahuasca before about 100 years ago, you start to find a number of references to indigenous cultures who apparently used it for battle, often as a tool for realizing when a battle needed to be fought, but sometimes apparently literally in advance of a battle itself. This runs counter to the modern understanding of ayahuasca as a psychedelic, which are typically either associated with anti-war sentiment and brotherly love, or an incapacitation so strong that it would severely impede any sort of combat. Peyote is also a psychedelic in high enough doses, acting on many of the same receptors as ayahuasca and producing visions that are somewhat similar to other classic psychedelics, such as psilocybin mushrooms or LSD. And yet, during my research, I came across multiple reports of people using peyote in order to give them the strength they needed for strenuous physical tasks, including warfare. It is possible that they were simply taking smaller doses, in much the same way that tech CEOs might take small doses of LSD to prepare for class warfare in the 21st century. But it's also possible that the culture of 16th century Mexican Indian tribes was different enough that taking peyote would help their soldiers prepare for battle, as opposed to the effect it had on 60s hippies who'd take these drugs and burn their draft cards. Another widely purported use of peyote from this era that is rarely discussed today is in remote vision, divination, or predicting the future. Whether or not you believe any of this is real, It's an experience that was widely reported in early Spanish accounts of peyote. A 16th century Spanish botanist studying Aztec peyote use reported that, and I quote, "It causes those devouring it to be able to foresee and to predict things, such, for instance, as whether the weather will continue to be favorable, or to discern who has stolen from them some utensils or anything else." He went on to write that the Chichimec, the Mexican Indians the Spanish were attempting to convert to Christianity at the time, fervently believed these visions. The Spanish were threatened by the tenacity with which tribes like the Chichimec held on to their beliefs about the supernatural powers of peyote, and the Inquisition was brought to bear to stamp out its use starting in 1620. Yet in spite of the Inquisition, many tribes held on to their beliefs about the divinatory power of the peyote cactus, and a number of Spanish missionaries and soldiers even became converts after trying the peyote as well. In 1631, a Spanish soldier confessed to the Inquisition that he had used peyote, apparently with some success, to track down clothes stolen by a local Indian. The Spanish conquest and the impact it had on the use and spread of peyote is a really fascinating bundle of contradictions, because on the one hand, it expressly forbade any peyote use that it saw as sacrilegious. It allowed medical uses in some cases when it saw them as valid, but that's a separate conversation. The church even went so far as to prepare a catechism to be used by priests during confessionals, and this is honestly pretty amazing to read from a 21st century perspective, because here's what Spanish priests were asking Indian churchgoers in the 17th century. "Hast thou eaten the flesh of man? Hast thou eaten the peyote? Do you suck the blood of others?" Let me translate this for a 21st century audience. Are you a vampire? Do you like peyote? No, really, are you a vampire? But this official church crackdown meant many families who had used it in their traditional religious and cultural practices had to hide it, much the same way that other Mexican tribes did with psilocybin mushrooms. So these families, who were told that their peyote use was morally equivalent to eating the flesh of man and sucking blood like a vampire, adopted Christianity officially, going to church and raising their children to be Catholic. And certainly a number of these families stopped using peyote entirely, either because they believed the propaganda or because they were afraid of violent punishment by the Spanish. But many kept using it even after converting to Christianity. And over time, this led to the birth of a syncretic religion. A syncretic religion, and you see this pretty commonly anywhere that Christian colonizers have attempted to convert a local population, which is a lot of places, is a religion or a sect of a religion that incorporates the religion of the colonizer with the local religion or spiritual practice. So as the territory under Spanish control spread up through Mexico into what's now Texas, Spanish colonists would often establish a mission in a town, convert the local Indian population to Catholicism, and then send those converts to other towns to start new missions there. If those Indian converts had previously used peyote, especially maybe if they'd grown up near the peyote gardens, then it's possible that this is how the peyote religion spread. For all their attempts to stamp out pagan beliefs and replace them with Catholicism, it's possible that they inadvertently spread the religious use of peyote far and wide, but in an altered form, a syncretic form, part indigenous, part Catholic. It's quite likely that the vast majority of peyote rituals we see today have been touched by the spread of Christianity. This is not a universal truth, and to this day there remain some peoples whose peyote use is relatively untouched by European religion. The Huichols, a Mexican Indian tribe that has lived for centuries in Mexico's Sierra Madre, are a rare example of this. To this day, Huichol pilgrims regularly make a 300-mile trek to harvest peyote in the Wirikuta Desert, a practice that has ostensibly been ongoing since before the arrival of conquistadors. The pilgrims take peyote in Wirikuta in a highly ritualized setting, then take a portion of their harvest home so that these pilgrims may undergo their own private peyote rituals with their families. The Huichol religion is not Christian, but rather animist. Animist religions see all of life itself, and sometimes even matter itself, as animated with a spirit that drives its movements and the unfolding of reality itself. The Huichol peyote rituals have doubtless changed with time, but are significantly less affected by European cosmology than pretty much any other peyote religion existing in the 21st century. But the Huichols are the exception that proves the rule. And the mark of religious colonization and syncretism can be seen pretty much anywhere else. And sometimes, embracing elements of Christianity was the only way that tribal nations could continue to practice any form of their religion, and the only way they could assert their own identities in the face of genocide. We'll talk more about this and the birth of the modern peyote religion on reservations in the United States after the break. When I was in elementary school, I was taught that the phrase Indian or American Indian was offensive and politically incorrect, and that the people who'd lived here before white people preferred to be called Native American. I can't blame the people who taught me this, they were doing their best, but this is an oversimplification, to put it mildly, and in fact neither of these phrases would have meant much to most indigenous habitants of the Americas until the late 1800s. There are over 500 federally recognized tribes within the boundary of the United States today, and those are just the ones for whom enough people survived disease, ecological catastrophe, and war to carry on a cultural identity. There was no such thing for most indigenous people on this continent as an Indian. That was the white man's term that implied the Comanche could be lumped in with the Arapaho, and that either of those groups had anything to do with the Navajo Nation of the desert Southwest, or the Ojibwe people of the Great Lakes region. And the phrase Native American did not yet exist at all. Well, it had been used, but usually by descendants of the Pilgrims who were opposed to immigration from Irish Catholics. It had absolutely nothing to do with the indigenous population, who were seen by European settlers and their descendants as savage. When I talked about the peyote religion during the last section of the episode, what I was really talking about is a number of different religions, each using the peyote cactus in some form and most incorporating Christian elements, but each different in its character and culturally bound to the tribe in which it was practiced. But while the Spanish missionaries and their Mexican Indian ambassadors were spreading a syncretic version of Catholicism that sometimes included peyote use through Mexico, a different story was happening in the northernmost reaches of Spanish-controlled territory. In 1680, Pueblo people in what is now New Mexico had revolted, expelling the Spanish from the region and stealing a number of their horses. Horses hadn't existed in North America for thousands of years, but within 100 years after this Pueblo revolt, their use spread across the Indian tribes of the Great Plains. The Comanche, ostensibly, had an uneasy peace with the Lipan Apache to their south, who in turn likely learned about peyote from the Carrizo, a now non-existent Mexican Indian tribe that lived near the peyote gardens. Yet sometimes this peace was broken, and the Comanche, alongside their Kiowa neighbors, were said to have launched raids on horseback into Lipan territory to their south, and it was quite possibly through these horseback raids that peyote found its way into the Great Plains sometime during the middle of the 19th century. If this seems complicated, that's because it is. It's also uncertain. Much of the history of these tribes and their respective alliances and wars has been lost or destroyed. And as fascinating as it is to try and trace the path that peyote took to becoming used by American Indian tribes, it's an endeavor that's almost tragically irrelevant. For starting in the 1830s and continuing through the rest of the century, the official policy of the US toward Indians was cultural destruction. The hardliners favored mass slaughter, while the more enlightened liberals preferred the humane policy of quote-unquote kill the Indian, save the man, which means don't literally kill them, just destroy everything that makes them unique. Either way, over the course of a matter of decades during the second half of the 1800s, hundreds of thousands of indigenous people, many from tribes who had historically nothing but hostility for each other, were moved onto reservations and forced to live side by side, away from their ancestral homelands, with no way to hold on to their past and no hope for their future. It is under these conditions of squalor and hopelessness that a number of movements emerged that promised hope and liberation for an oppressed people. On New Year's Day in 1889, a Paiute man named Wovika had a profound vision during a solar eclipse. He was told by God that a new world had been created for the Indians, in which the white Europeans would have no part, and that through the mass enactment of a ritual dance, this new world could be brought into being. If this story sounds familiar, it's likely on account of the shocking tragedy of its ending. This dance became known as the Ghost Dance and spread like wildfire through the reservations of the Great Plains, and the messianic fervor with which it gripped its participants was deeply threatening to American settlers, who, like colonists anywhere, feared nothing more than their subjects doing to them what they had done to their subjects. The ghost dance movement became especially widespread among the Lakota people of South Dakota, and in response to a still unknown provocation, if there was one at all, officials in the 7th Cavalry massacred over 250 people after disarming them and escorting them to Wounded Knee Creek. Their only crime was participating in a dance that they believed would liberate them from oppression, and along with those 250 men, women, and children, the ghost dance died at Wounded Knee as well. It was in the wake of this massacre that the Peyote religion emerged as an alternative means of liberation. And unlike the ghost dance, this was an inner liberation, one that, for better or for worse, did not rely on an overthrow of their oppressors, one that could be achieved by individuals and their communities in spite of the ongoing genocide they were undergoing. If you ask a modern American Indian practitioner of peyotism, as it's sometimes known, about how it emerged, you're likely to hear a different story from the one I told earlier when I attempted to explain how the cactus had spread from Mexico up into the Great Plains. What you're likely to hear is the religious explanation, that peyote was given to the Plains Indians by God, or the Great Spirit, at their time of need, as a way to heal from the ongoing trauma being inflicted upon them. Most importantly, what you'll probably hear is that wherever it came from, whichever tribe first practiced some version of the modern peyote religion, it became a pan-Indian religion in the wake of the ghost dance and the slaughter at Wounded Knee. In fact, for many peyote users, it was a critical component of their Indian identity, an identity that had not existed until very recently. Peyote use was one of the defining characteristics of having Indian identity for many people, and the peyote ceremonies that spread across reservations in Oklahoma at the end of the 19th and start of the 20th centuries helped Indians preserve this identity in the face of a country that still sought to destroy it, through sending Indian children to boarding schools designed to strip them of their culture and assimilate them into white culture. In this sense, the peyote religion, despite having psychedelic drug use at its core, was quite conservative. And on that subject, you'll notice also how little I've talked about the actual effects of peyote in this episode. Obviously, the cactus is capable of producing a visual spectacle, much like other psychedelics, as well as feelings of transcendence, unity, spiritual awakening. But unlike Western psychonauts, who are always more than eager to attempt to describe their experiences, indigenous peyote users, particularly those who use it as a part of their religious practices, see attempting to describe the mental and visual effects of the drug as missing the point. It's not about the effects of the plant, but rather its role within the ceremony, and within society as a whole. And while the psychedelic movements of the 60s would sometimes tear families apart and encourage young people to drop out of society, the opposite was true about indigenous peyote ceremonies, which were often undergone by entire families at the same time, and which encouraged their participants to be productive and devoted members of society. And just as importantly, encouraged them not to drink alcohol, which was genuinely devastating people living on reservations at the time. In order to assuage the fears of white settlers and missionaries who saw the potential for the peyote religion to become a subversive element that could become threatening like the ghost dance, peyote advocates argued that their religion was not a threat to white America or to Christianity. In fact, they argued that it was a form of Christianity. Unlike the syncretic religions of Mexico, which had eaten peyote in secret while practicing Catholicism in public, peyotists on American Indian reservations held peyote ceremonies in the open, and skilled orators such as Comanche chief Quanah Parker argued passionately to white Americans that peyote and Christianity belonged together as naturally as peanut butter and jelly. "The white man goes into his church and talks about Jesus," Quanah famously said. "The Indian goes into his teepee and talks with Jesus." Privately, Quanah Parker never believed in Christianity, but to quote the historian Mike Jay, he spoke its language fluently. He knew that in order for the peyote religion to survive without violent crackdown, it had to incorporate elements of Christianity. He also knew that if Indians could get their peyote use accepted as an essential component of a federally recognized religious group, it would be much harder to ban. If they could do this, it would be a way for American Indians to get their foot in the door and take advantage of a system that was fundamentally not designed to work for or represent them. In August of 1918, representatives of the Comanche, Kiowa, Apache, Cheyenne, Oto, and Ponca tribes met to sign the Charter of Incorporation of the Native American Church, whose stated mission was to foster and promote the religious beliefs of the several tribes of Indians in the state of Oklahoma in the Christian religion, and whose text explicitly stated that the practice of the peyote sacrament would be an essential component of this worship. As groundbreaking as this meeting was for so many reasons, including giving their peyote use First Amendment protections for the first time, it's also significant for another reason. It was the first ever time that indigenous inhabitants of the U.S. referred to themselves as Native American. As long as there has been peyote use on tribal reservations, there has been opposition to this peyote use for countless reasons. This was certainly true before the 1918 incorporation of the Native American Church. Reservation officials in the 1890s, fearing that peyote use would get out of hand, threatened Indians with loss of government-supplied food rations and lease money if they continued to use peyote. This is illegal, of course, as it directly violates treaties that the U.S. government signed with the tribes living on these reservations, but it's hardly the only time our government has flagrantly violated these treaties. And during Prohibition, reservation officials tried to use anti-alcohol statutes to ban peyote, and since drunkenness was seen as a huge problem on reservations in this era, this interpretation of the law had pretty widespread public approval, though an American court eventually ruled that peyote prohibitions based off anti-alcohol laws had no legal justification. Now, after the incorporation of the Native American Church, the legal crackdown against peyote continued, and in some places its use was banned entirely. Oklahoma had managed to protect its legality, due in part to Quanah Parker's lobbying efforts, but other states like Colorado, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Idaho all started to ban the cactus during the 1920s. By 1930, peyote use was illegal in most states with sizable Indian populations, aside from Oklahoma. But for members of the Native American Church, this legal status became much more of a gray area and one that's been debated for decades, even into the 21st century. It wasn't until 1934 that the Native American Church, or NAC, expanded into other states, so until that point, it wasn't recognized as an official religious organization outside of Oklahoma. But once its articles of incorporation were modified to allow branches to form in other states, its membership exploded, and in 1950, church leadership decided to create a federal organization called the Native American Church of the United States. And in 1955, after years of communication with Canadian indigenous people, they call themselves First Nations people up there, the name changed again, this time to the Native American Church of North America, which is still the name today. In states where the Native American Church was officially incorporated, it's actually almost remarkable how well this umbrella of a religious organization protected the use of peyote by official church members during sanctioned ceremonies. It's not as if these ceremonies were immune to harassment by the police and state officials, but time and time again, higher courts ruled in favor of religious freedom, protecting the right of church members to use this drug in their ceremonies, even when the drug was prohibited for non-members. In 1960, Mary Atakai, a member of Navajo Nation and of the church, was arrested off the reservation for peyote possession and for violating Arizona state law. She appealed this arrest, and the following year, the Supreme Court ruled in her favor, dismissing the complaint and setting the precedent that state laws prohibiting peyote use could not be used as justification to arrest Native American church members, even if those members weren't on tribal land. Now, this is very interesting, because think about what this says. If you're in a state where the law says it's completely illegal to have peyote in your possession, the higher law, this Supreme Court interpretation of federal law, says that if the state law were applied against you, it would be religious discrimination, which is illegal under the First Amendment. And I want you to hold this information in your head while I tell you about another case that was happening right around the same time. Because remember how I told you that Mary Atakai was a member of Navajo Nation? Well, it turns out that Navajo Nation had, on its books, a peyote ban, which had been there since 1940. The 1940 law had said that peyote was not connected to any traditional religious practice and described it as, quote-unquote, harmful and foreign to our traditional way of life. Fast forward to 1959, and the Native American Church asked the federal government to prohibit the Navajo Tribal Council from restricting peyote ceremonies, arguing that the Navajo Tribal Council's peyote ban was a violation of the First Amendment. A federal appeals court struck this request down and ruled that the First Amendment does not apply to Indian tribes, and that the tribal government of Navajo Nation had full authority to prohibit peyote. So think about this fascinating bundle of contradictions here. Mary Atakai was arrested for violating Arizona state law and had her case dismissed because to do otherwise would have been a First Amendment violation. But if she'd been arrested by tribal authorities within the established boundaries of Navajo Nation for peyote possession, she could have been given a 9-month jail sentence and a $100 fine, and there is absolutely nothing the US government could have done. Now, personally, I'm against any and all drug prohibition, no matter who's doing it. I mean, with the obvious exceptions, keeping children safe, whatever. I just don't believe it's the government's business to punish people for putting a substance into their own bodies. But it's actually a remarkably progressive interpretation of tribal sovereignty that the Supreme Court had at this time, acknowledging that they couldn't arrest a Native American church member for using peyote, but that they also couldn't force the Navajo Nation to allow peyote ceremonies either. I could go on and on about cases like these, but the thrust of it is that decade after decade, practitioners of the peyote religion have used the structure of the NAC to protect their religious practice from wildly fluctuating laws. One of the most fascinating documents I stumbled across is a letter from a man named John Finlador, who was the director of the FDA Bureau of Drug Abuse and Control, written to the federal branch of the Native American Church in 1966. And in this letter, Finlador is remarkably frank about how past efforts to prohibit peyote were morally indefensible, ignorant, and harmful to religious freedom. He quotes an expert in a peyote hearing from the 1930s who expressed amazement that nobody who wrote these anti-peyote laws had ever seen a peyote ceremony or tried it themselves. It all feels very informed and enlightened, and then immediately Finlador starts talking about the scourge of hallucinogen abuse sweeping the nation and how these drugs could cause permanent insanity. The first half of the letter is informed and magnanimous, and the second half is straight drug war propaganda. But it all still has an interesting core, because he writes, and I quote, "It is not the function of the government to ensure a supply of peyote to your church. We do, however, encourage your creation and proposals of a scheme or organization whereby commercial peyote distributors may be assured that their shipments to you are indeed legal shipments." Basically, this FDA bureau chief is making it clear that the drug war is only going to ramp up, and if the Native American Church wants to maintain a supply of peyote for its ceremonies, it's on them to figure out how to do that. Which brings us to today. and to a development that many casual observers of drug policy may find perplexing. The Native American Church has come out against peyote decriminalization initiatives. This has put them at odds with anti-prohibitionist groups, and the Church has had some very public confrontations about this, including with a lobbying group called Decriminalize Nature, which has advocated for the decriminalization of all entheogenic plants, and that's just a catch-all term that roughly means capable of inducing a spiritual experience. Chief among these plants, alongside psilocybe mushrooms and tryptamine-containing shrubs used to make ayahuasca, is peyote. And Decrim Nature, for as laudable as its goals are, has been remarkably chauvinistic in how it has publicly spoken about the Native American Church. Here's what they said. "We honor the work of those who created the Native American Church by pursuing broader, more open models of liberation based on the realities of today. As they fought for us, the 7th generation, we fight for those who come after us, 7 generations from now." This is an amazingly out-of-touch statement about an active church with hundreds of thousands of members, a church whose membership has fought for their right to take this plant as a sacrament, free from persecution, decade after decade, when all other aspects of their culture were under siege. Now, do I agree with the church's position on peyote? To be honest, I'm not sure. But I find it very understandable why it came to the conclusion it did. When psychedelics first became popular among white Americans, that FDA bureaucrat wrote to the church and told them that it wasn't the government's job to make sure they had continued access to peyote. Now we're in what people are calling the psychedelic renaissance, and these drugs are more popular than ever. The NAC's message is very clear. White people, you can do any other psychedelic in the world, even mescaline. Take mescaline sulfate made in a lab. Take San Pedro cactus, but leave peyote for us. Remember, peyote can take years, even decades to grow, and it only grows in that small patch of desert in South Texas and northern Mexico, the fabled peyote gardens. And more so than ever, peyote is in danger. If peyote is decriminalized without being properly protected, and people flock to the peyote gardens, that could decimate a fragile ecosystem that is sacred to many tribes. Already, the Huichol people, that Mexican Indian tribe whose peyote religion managed to survive Christianity, are having a harder time finding peyote on their sacred pilgrimages, and have asked the Mexican government to protect their root. The problem with selective decriminalization, allowing Native Americans to continue using peyote while keeping it a criminal offense for others, is that it doesn't solve the underlying problem. How do we actually protect the supply of peyote? Even if we keep things exactly as they are, the fact remains that 90% of the peyote gardens are on privately owned land, which means the biggest threat is not enthusiastic psychonauts, but ranching and real estate development. As always, it's industry and capital that do more damage than individuals. Now, personally, I favor an approach that prioritizes preservation of the peyote gardens for sacred use. Recognize peyote as the endangered species that it is, and pass legislation to protect it. I also favor this approach because when laws have been selectively applied to a racial, ethnic, or religious group in the past, this has had problematic implications, even when they're ostensibly designed to protect the cultural practices of that group. There's actually a case that's a fascinating parallel to peyote, and that's the so-called eagle feather law, which was passed to protect the bald eagle from extinction while also allowing Native Americans to continue to use eagle feathers in their religious and cultural rituals, which is fairly common for a number of tribes. This law banned bald eagle hunting of any kind unless you got a permit that requires documented Native American ancestry in a federally recognized tribe. Functionally, this means that many Native Americans are unable to get eagle permits if they don't have the proper documentation. If peyote remains criminalized with a carve-out for the Native American Church, I worry that this would not actually do much to conserve the peyote lands, and may inadvertently make it more difficult for people to practice their religious beliefs if, for some reason, they don't have documentation of being church members. But when I look at this whole history that I've outlined today, the history of cultures that have fought tooth and nail to preserve their traditions and continue to do so to this day, I can't help but feel that it doesn't matter too much what I favor personally. I'm sure that many people from all cultures and walks of life have had a personal relationship with peyote, or have had transformative spiritual experiences after taking it. But there's a difference between having a personal relationship with a substance and a cultural relationship with that substance. If those were the same, I wouldn't be doing this podcast. So all I can really say to anyone listening to this podcast, maybe you've had the most transformative experience with peyote, maybe you participated in a ceremony, or maybe you just ate some buttons on a hillside and watched the sunset. That's fantastic. It's wonderful. But it may not be your battle to fight for this plant. And there are people who will say that you shouldn't even take it at all. And I'm not saying that, but if you've made it this far into the episode, I'm sure you can at the very least see where they're coming from. Plant species that produce a spiritual experience are a dime a dozen. That's why I'm not worried about running out of episode topics. But not everybody has a cultural connection to peyote that is inextricably tied to the survival of that culture. And at the end of the day, those people should get the first priority in deciding the future of this plant. I'm Sky Hawthorne, and you've been listening to Drug Cultures. Thank you so much for listening, as always. If you liked what you heard and you have questions or comments or just want to reach out and get in touch, you can follow me on Twitter at DrugCulturesPod, Instagram at drug_cultures, or shoot me an email at drugculturespodcast@gmail.com. If you loved it, if you hated it, if you want to be my friend, or if you have a topic you'd be interested in learning more about in a future episode, please, please, please do not hesitate to reach out. And as always, nothing I say should be taken as medical advice. I am not a doctor. Everything expressed on this show is purely for the purposes of entertainment, education, and occasionally harm reduction.